welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to discuss on HTTP status codes. Whether you are a developer, engineer, team lead, or full stack developer, you must have come across this particular term, that is HTTP status code. And whether you have been attending any interviews and you have been part of many interviews, right, you must have seen, like, this is one of the pretty important questions where developers are asked what is the status codes, like what is status code 201, uh, what is the status code 5404, like when do we use it. If you don't recollect, and most of them you don't recollect this particular HTTP status code, how do you handle error codes and error handling, and then what are the status codes when you want to return the error codes, right? What is the status code for internal server error? So if you are aware of this particular thing, status codes in depth, then you will be able to answer any questions with respect to HTTP status codes. And people nowadays who are working on microservices, prepare creating HTTP uh, REST API services, right? This will be very helpful for them. So I've explained what are the status codes used with all the different variations. Okay, so I hope this video will be helpful to all the developer who are not well aware of this particular status code and when to use it, right? So let's begin to you. So out of five high level status codes at the top, right? So 1xx, so informational. This is one of the status codes which starts with 1 and then some numbers, right? Those are all information responses. So this indicates that the request is received by the client server, and it's been processed. Okay, so in this terminology of microservices, or in terms of client server applications, right, there are servers and client, right? So when the request is hit by the client, it ultimately lands at the server side, right? So this what informational response is indicating that the request is received at the server end and it is being processed. Okay, so the very first thing is 100, the continue. So this, the server, what happens is that when the server receives the request, it acknowledges the request header, and the client can send the request body. Okay, so it allows the client to send the request body. So it is used in the chunk uploads, large post requests which are very big, right, to save the bandwidth of that particular, right? So in that case we use it. Now into 101, now this is one of the switching protocol related number. This means the server is switching to a different protocol as requested by the client. So there are WebSocket handshakes, for an example, which are used. So 101 is used for that. Now processing 102, as I mentioned, that server, when the server request is handed or landed on the server, right, the server accept the request and it is trying to process and it is going to handle that particular request. So in that way we use it. So whenever you are seeing that 102, right, it's basically processing that request. Okay, so 103, it's an early hint. It allows the resources to be preloaded, right? So in parallel to that, it is trying to prepare the response as well. Okay, hope this 1x X related information responses are you're clear about it. Let's move on to the 2x, right? So this is basically indicates that the request was successfully processed by the server, right? And there was no problem. So everything went well. There is nothing as an error or some mistake hasn't happened. So everything, the request was perfect. The server has handled the request. It has processed the request. It has given the response, right? So what happens is that there are different status codes. So 200 is one of the OK status, which means that the request succeeded. The response contains the requested data. So whatever the client has requested, right, it has responded to it. So basically a standard response for a successful, like when you're trying to call any getter method, post method, or a put reference. So basically you're trying to get some information from the server. Let's say you are trying to create one resource or any of this particular resource, right? Or you're trying to update certain value inside your request for an existing element, right? So in those scenario you get the response as 200, right? Now 201, this is specifically used in case of post request. Now when you're trying to create a new resource on the server side, you get a 201 that is created. Okay, so the server responds with the post to the post request by creating a resource on the server. So let's say you're creating a user, right? Or anything, right, which you are creating. So the end user wanted to know whether it is created or not, specifically with the help of 201. Okay, so 202, if you see it, the request has been accepted for processing, but it has not completed yet. Okay, so it is in the process, but it is still not completed. Okay, so that's an asynchronous operations which we perform, right? So that in that case we use it. Now 204. Now what happens? The request succeeded, but we have not, let's say, responded anything. Okay, there is nothing to be responded. Let's say in case of get, right, we have requested something and we are getting it. But in case of 204, it means that you have the request is processed, whatever the client has requested, right? But ultimately there is nothing to be responded. Okay, only the status code is being sent out, right? So there is no response body to it. Okay, so let's say in the case of delete, whether you're trying to delete some resource from the server, right? Or you perform some delete operation. So in that case, we use 204. Okay, so where in that particular request, you get a response of the status code that it is been 204, but you will not get a response because there is nothing to respond and return, right? Okay, hope you got this particular status code of 2x, right? Let's move on to 3xx redirection. So basically these are all the status codes which are used for the redirection. Now this indicates that the client needs to take further action on it. Okay, now what happens in terms of like when the client lands on the server, then server gives an information to the client that you need to perform some additional steps. Okay, so 301, so this is 3xx is related to that only, right? So client needs to take further actions. Okay, so 301, that is moved permanently. Now this is what happens is that the resource has been permanently moved to the new URL. Now what happens is, you must have seen that when you are opening any website and you get to know that this particular resource is uh, uh, I mean, you have a link and then you said that this is request is moved, or even you're trying to Google, let's say, search something with an old previous URL, right? It is automatically redirected to that. So this, in that case, your permanent, it is moved to, there's some different locations, right? So new URL. Now 302, the resource is temporarily located, but at a different URL, right? So it is temporarily redirecting that. Okay. So 304, not modified. The resources has not changed in the last request. So whatever the request you have used, right, it is cached up. But and then there is no change also when you're trying to again request that same thing. There is nothing 302. There is no modified. So this will reduce your load on the server. So it will the bandwidth. It will reduce the bandwidth, right? So it will take up from the cache. Now temporary redirect, that is 307. The resource is temporarily moved to another URL, and method should remain the same. Okay. So in similar to 302, whatever it is, but it is strict method retention. Okay. Hope you are good with the redirection. Now 404 XX plays a very important role. It gives the end user who is requesting it, right? It gives a very informative status code in the responses, so that if the request is not properly sent out, or not let's say some changes has happened, so it gives a clear indication to the client that there are some certain issues at your request which you are trying to send to the server, and it is not as per the expectation, right? So now, just for instance, 400, which is a bad request, the server cannot understand the request due to the invalid syntax. So there is some problem with the syntax. There is some problem with the request which is coming, right? So let's say JSON, right? So it is not in the proper format. It's an invalid. So there are some missing fields inside it, right? Or mandatory fields or something like that. So this is something which is which imposes to the caller that you are not requesting it correct. Okay, 401. Now this is used in terms of authentication and basically when you're trying to access certain resource, okay, and you get a 401, it basically indicates that that particular resource you are not authorized to access. You need to first authenticate yourself, okay. So in that case, but you have not so that's what you are not particularly authorized to access it, okay. So there is some missing or expired tokens, right, or something has expired, right? So in that case we use 401. Now 403 forbidden. The server understand that the request has come, but it doesn't allow them to access. So it will refuse to authorize it. Okay. So what happens that let's say the user who is trying to access it has not got the permission. So what you have to do is that either you will not be allowed to access that request, or you have to certainly align to that particular permissions or a role which will allow to access this particular resource. Okay. Now 404, this is very important, and also many developer faces this issue. uh, so the requested resource which you are trying to access, or any of this particular web service or microservices, right? The link is not the link is broken, and it is correct endpoint is not provided, or okay, so the server is not up. So that particular it might be the reason, right? So in that case we don't find that, and we will not be able to process the request. So in that case 404 comes. 405, the method is not allowed. Now what happens is that the requested method, let's say you are requesting for a certain getter method, but whatever it is written in the post or something, and any other in the method, right? So the requested method is not allowed on the resource. So example, as I mentioned, when you're trying to use the post on a resources, that is only accept the get, right? You will not be so you will get a response that is 405, it is method not allowed. Okay. Now 409, conflict. Now what happens, the request conflicts with the current state of the resource. Now duplicate entries are there, there is a conflicting update, right? For certain scenarios we can use this 409, so it's an indication, right? So there is something wrong, right? Now 429, there are too many requests. This is used in the microservices context, where there are too many requests are coming to that particular server, and it is not able to handle. The client sent back that too many requests in the given time, so in a certain frame you are limiting certain requests, right? So it is called API rate limiting. Hope you are good with this particular 4xx client codes. Now, now we have talked about the request or the code which are at the client side, right? Now, this particular, when you are talking about 5xx, it deals with the server side errors. So basically, the request has gone to that, everything, the request is perfect, everything is good or something, right? So there is no problem with the client, right? Now this indicates that all the issues which are the messages or the servers and the issues you are getting are on the server side. Let's say 500 internal server, the server encountered some unexpected conditions. So generally some error has come when the server failed to handle the request, there is not able to process the request, right? So in that case 500 comes in. Now 502, bad gateway. Now what happened, the server received an invalid response from an upstream server. Now what, but basically this happens when we have some reverse proxies or a load balancer which is not properly handled properly, right? So in that case we get that 502. Now 503, service unavailable. Now server is temporarily unable to handle the request, right? In that case, either it is in the maintenance mode, they are doing some overloading test situations there are there, right? So in that case 503, the service unavailable comes. Now 504, gateway timeout. The server has received the request, but the server has not responded in a certain duration or time frame, right? There is always a certain time frame for a certain response to go in, right? Because it's an synchronous request, like it cannot wait until a long time, right? So the upstream server should return some response in a certain time frame, or else 50 get fires. So there might be some issues like there is a lot of data to be collected, or if they did not process that particular database problem, network problem, anything, right? It might be the problem. Now, there are some common scenarios which I've noted down. So, based in, let's say you are for the security perspective, if you see authentication is the flow, right? As I earlier mentioned, 401 is unauthorized, and then 403 is forbidden, right? Now, caching, the 304, it is not modified. The same request will respond the same response, right? If you want to bring from the cache. Now, what are the best practices for the REST API? Like when you're writing when you're developing your services or API, right? It should be according to the REST API standards, right? So making use of 200, 201 whenever required, 204, 400, 404, appropriately handling those kind of requests, giving those particular responses for the correct situation can play a magic. And if you see many big giant providers, right, they provide the software APIs, right, to make use of, let's say you wanted to integrate some API for sending messages. Now they have developed their APIs. They will create, like, these are the 200 requests, these are the 400 requests, these are the requests which should come in this way. So preparedly they have already prepared certain skeleton. So you have to work accordingly, right? So rate limiting. Now there are, as I mentioned, when too many requests are coming to the particular server, you can restrict it with that 429. Error handling, as I mentioned, server side related thing. So 500 is basically internal server error. 502 bit we already discussed, right? So these are all services which already we discussed. Now there are tools, or how we can handle tests. Let's say you have developed certain services, right? And you have written the error handling logic, you have written the response, the error codes, error status, and the response, right? So basically to test that particular services, right, there are different ways to test it. Now let's say if you are enabling your application with Swagger or Open API, right? So you will be definitely having that particular application up, that, right? In that particular same URL, you will be able to test that Swagger, right? Or there are certain different tools like Postman, right? It is used for getting the uh, requesting the request, and then getting the response. So it has different provisions to send the JSON request, text request. There are certain ways you can include the header, there you can add the authorization data, you can add security related information, you can add n number of things you can handle in this Postman, right? So you'll be able to, it will act as a client where you will be able to process that request, right? And curl, basically this is used for quick testing in the command line interface only, right? So this is where we make use of this. Okay. And this is something which the REST client IDs, we have IntelliJ, VS Code, we have some built-in REST in clients as well. Okay. Hope this video was helpful to you. If this video was helpful, then please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Also share it with all the needy people who are required and trying to prepare for an interview, and also stuck up, or maybe have always confusion about the HTTP status code. Hope this video was helpful. Thank you for